Then there are problems with birth defects and genetic defects. And so the idea that grows in many cultures was to forbid incest. But this varies from culture to culture. In the U.S., it varies from state to state. California and most of the states along the Atlantic seaboard allow first cousins to marry. When I was a minister in Maryland, I was surprised to look on a marriage license and see the question, bride's relationship to the groom. I said, really? I didn't know that was possible. But above the Mason-Dixon line, in Pennsylvania and all the way across to Oregon, first cousins are not allowed to marry. In Nevada, where people are allowed to marry each other after knowing each other for 15 minutes or less, marrying a first cousin, is a criminal offense. You could actually get arrested for it. These laws presume that the purpose of marriage is to have children. And so some states make the exception for first cousins who want to get married if they are unable to have children. This idea that children are the purpose of marriage has been passed down, and that it was very important before the 20th century, when contraception was before the century, it was widely viewed as immoral within the institution of marriage. The 1876 Book of Conjugal Sins insisted that contraceptive attempts degrades to bestiality the true feelings of manhood and the holy state of matrimony. So during a period of anti-contraception feeling and laws in the 19th century, more than half the states enacted laws that criminalized and prevented any sex love or any making love without making babies. And this only changed in 1965 in Griswold versus Connecticut, when such laws were overturned. But it has reemerged in the healthcare debate, where the idea that somehow making health insurance companies cover contraception violates church and state. And so there are candidates and there are people in legislatures who are trying to prevent contraception from being legal, attacks on Planned Parenthood, which provides contraception to people in low income. All of this is predicated on the idea of what marriage is for the raising of children. And that's used as an argument as to why gays and lesbians cannot get married, because they cannot have children except by adoption or artificial insemination or some other means. They can't do it naturally as God intended, I guess. But there are also a lot of heterosexual couples who can't have children naturally as God intended. But I think if God gave us reason to figure out ways around biology, we have the ways to get around it, and they are God-given ways. But I think the idea of marriage only for the purpose of children is ridiculous. I have married people who were in their 70s. I don't think they were planning to have any children. Also, historically, the marriage contract was for money. According to Graff in her book, for centuries and in many parts of the world, marriage could not take place without a dowry. The money, goods, or estate that a woman brought to her husband in marriage, or a gift of money or property by a man to or for his bride. In 1425, the city of Florence, Italy, even launched a savings bond institution in which a family could invest for a daughter's future dowry with returns up to 15.5% compounded annually, with both capital and interest paid to the husband after consummation. In the 1700s and 1800s, many laws extended the biblical idea that husband and wife become one flesh. In British law, a 1765 statement by Lord Blackstone read, "In law, husband and wife are one person, and the husband is that person." This meant that the wife could own no personal property, make no personal contracts, and bring no lawsuits. The husband took over her legal identity. The concept was called coverture because his identity covered hers. So when you think about what marriage was like, I think of Thomas Jefferson, who married a woman under these laws, and that white woman that he married was in a sense his slave, because he then became her person. And so when that lady died and he married her half-sister, who had the same father but a slave mother, he was marrying a slave. And so the difference in those two unions, in the eyes of the law at the time, all women were slaves once they got married, and slaves were doubly so. Now, some social theorists say that the rise of single parenthood, of women raising children alone, is correlated with lower economic standards for children. They argue that bad values cause poverty. But this correlation is not causation. I wonder if it's not the poverty that has been causing the lack of marriages. The war on drugs in the past 40 years has disproportionately affected black and Hispanic fathers. Once in the criminal justice system, their employability diminishes, and mothers often decide, I can be poor by myself. And then also the earning power of workers of both sexes has decreased over the past 30 years. The stress of two people working increases stresses in marriages and is a leading cause of divorce. If we are going to argue that marriage should be for money, well then a marriage between two males has the highest income potential, because women only earn 80% for every dollar that men earn. And so two males is the most economically viable marriage, and those who argue for marriage to prevent poverty really should be advocating males being married and then adopting children. But I haven't heard that argument. So what happens is when marriage is separated from tribe and from property, there's this idea that marriage is more for love than for money. So when marriage is for property, if you walk away from that marriage, and this still happens, but it's what holds people together is that contract. It is not just a contract between two people. It's a contract between two families. It's a contract in royal families between two countries. It could be in if you stop being in love with your spouse, it could be a cause for war in the ancient forms of marriage. But love is a more tangible, less tangible and more fleeting thing. And so the idea that we can step out of marriage when we are no longer in love. And such a radical concept started right here in Indiana. In 1850, Indiana's state legislature passed the most open divorce law the United States had ever known. It stated that judges could grant divorce for any reason at all, not just under conditions of adultery, attempted murder, or other extreme circumstances. Though scandalous at the time, divorce has been common and an acceptable practice within mainstream America. So here in Indiana began that so-called slippery slope to the end of marriage. No-fault divorce has become the norm. Of course, there is property involved, and it usually falls in the favor of the male. After most divorce settlements, the earning potential or the household income of a male goes up, and women, because they usually have the children, usually goes down, the standard of living. And so women have gotten some freedom in the loosening of divorce laws. They are no longer the property of their husbands, but but these inequities still remain. The argument against gay marriage is often that it's just not natural. And that same argument was used for interracial marriages, that it was not natural. That in 1948, the California Supreme Court led the way in challenging racial discrimination and became the first state high court to declare unconstitutional an anti-miscegenation law. Now, miscegenation means a mixture of races, especially marriage or cohabitation between a white person and a member of another race. They weren't too concerned if blacks and Asians or blacks and Indians or an Indian and an Asian were getting together. It was really about keeping the white race pure. And it wasn't until 1967 that the United States Supreme Court struck down the remaining interracial marriage laws. And when Massachusetts passed a law allowing marriage in their state, people went back to a law that was written at the turn of the century that was saying that they would not marry people who came to their state to avoid marriages that were prohibited in other states. That law that was used to prevent gay people from coming to Massachusetts to get married willy-nilly, that was a law that was written to prevent interracial couples going to Massachusetts to get married. Bill Sinkford, the former head of our denomination, writes about marriage in Massachusetts. He says, in May of 2004, this issue exploded in Massachusetts. The previous fall, the state's highest court had found no compelling reason to deny same-sex couples the rights and responsibilities of civil marriage. In response, the state legislature took up an amendment to the state constitution that would define marriage as only between one man and one woman. Demonstrators on both sides of the issue lined Beacon Street in front of the Golden Dome, Massachusetts State House. The national headquarters of the Unitarian Universalist Association happens to be located right next door. As a faith community, we had a decision to make. We could either be quiet or we could express our values. We decided to be articulate. We hung a 16 by 20 foot banner on our building facing the State House reading, "Civil marriage is a civil right." This ensured that state legislators looking out their windows when they were in session would see our message. Many of us stood out on Beacon Street as well. We stood there not in angry protest, but as people of faith who believe that all religious and the civil institutions of marriage should be confused. But as people of faith who believe that the religious and the civil institutions of marriage should not be confused, and our government should take seriously its charge to be even-handed, favoring no religion or religious view over another. It's not an issue just about constitutional rights. Marriage equality touches the lives of real people. On May 17, 2004, I had the privilege of marrying Hillary and Julie Goodridge in the chapel of our Beacon Street headquarters. Hillary and Julie have been committed to one another now for 18 years. For 18 years, they have cared for each other in sickness and in health, and they are mothers to a wonderful daughter, Annie. They take her to soccer games, they attend PTA meetings, they love one another and threaten no one.